Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring a truly fascinating perspective on a debate that honestly impacts absolutely everyone. We're talking about how we approach education, personal development, and ultimately, who is really responsible for our success. We are going to be reevaluating some incredibly common assumptions about the systems we live in and looking at an argument that seriously pushes back against the grain to propose a completely different paradigm for prosperity.
Okay, so let's dive right into this. To really ground our analysis today, we're looking at a foundational text called The Laws of Prosperity. Specifically, we'll be focusing on its very first chapter, which is titled Beyond Moral Education, originally published way back in April of 1998. Now, this text offers a really sharp, philosophical look at education and societal reform. And while it specifically addresses the context of the Japanese school system at that time, the core arguments it makes about human nature, accountability, and success, they are incredibly universal. It all kicks off with this deeply provocative question. Think about this for a second. When we see a crisis in our schools or in the development of young people, who is truly to blame? Is it a broken system that has totally failed the individual? Or does the responsibility lie squarely on the shoulders of the individual themselves? Keep this question in the back of your mind as we go, because the source material takes a very decisive stance on the answer, and it starts by analyzing a specific type of crisis. Section 1. The Education System Crisis. Analyzing the breakdown.
So, the text outlines a scenario that might sound super familiar to you. When severe problems erupt in schools, we're talking about specific issues like intense bullying and incidents of violence. Society tends to have a very predictable reflex. The conventional wisdom, as analyzed in the text, immediately points the finger at systemic flaws. Pundits and leaders will step up and claim there's a critical lack of moral education in the curriculum. Or they'll heavily criticize the school system for being overly obsessed with standardized test scores, which is a direct reference to Japan's intense deviation score, or Hensachi system. People argue that this pressure cooker environment naturally breeds bad behavior. Society's default is basically to say, hey, the system is broken and it's failing our youth. But the author introduces a massive pivot here, fiercely critiquing the standard societal reaction.
Section 2. The Collective Responsibility Trap. The Danger of Blame.
We're essentially looking at two totally contrasting views here. On one side, you have society's default reaction, systemic blame. This is the idea that the structure, the curriculum, or the environment is the root cause of an individual's misbehavior. But on the flip side, we have the author's primary focus, which is individual accountability. The text makes the case that constantly pointing at the system is actually a dangerous avoidance tactic, one that prevents us from addressing the real underlying issue. In fact, the author uses a really strong, specific phrase to describe this phenomenon. They call it the foolishness of collective responsibility. The argument being made here is that when we blame an abstract concept, like the education system or some vague lack of moral education, for a highly specific act of bullying or violence, we are basically saying everyone is to blame. And, well, when everyone is collectively responsible, no single person is actually held accountable. It just becomes this massive diffusion of responsibility. So the crucial takeaway from this critique is that systemic blame fundamentally dilutes individual accountability. By constantly shifting the focus over to structural reforms or curriculum changes whenever a crisis happens, the text argues that we're actually doing a huge disservice to the individual. We're stripping them of their agency, kind of masking the reality that at the end of the day, an individual has to be responsible for their own actions and their own mind. If the system isn't the core problem, then how should we view the tools the system provides, like learning and knowledge?
Section 3. Redefining Academic Ability. A New Perspective. The author completely reframes the whole purpose of traditional learning here. Rather than viewing academic ability as just a metric for a test score, which, as we just saw, society often criticizes as the root of the problem, the text maps out a completely different logical flow. Step 1 is gaining academic ability and knowledge, but that isn't the end goal. Step 2 shows that this knowledge is actually a mechanism for achieving true personal freedom. It expands your options, right? It expands your capabilities in the world, which then leads directly to step 3, using that hard-earned freedom to actually produce happiness. So the absolutely crucial point here is that knowledge and academic rigor are not these oppressive forces causing societal decay. Quite the opposite, actually. The text presents knowledge as a fundamental tool for personal freedom. It's like an empowering lever you pull to lift yourself up and navigate life on your own terms, completely independent of whatever the quote-unquote system happens to be doing. And this naturally brings us to the philosophical solutions proposed by the author for actually navigating life successfully.
Section 4, Cultivating Positive Thinking. Navigating Life.
Now, the text uses a very specific, empowering vocabulary here. It introduces the concept of a producer of happiness. Just think about the agency in that phrase for a second. It describes an individual who actively and intentionally creates their own joy and success. This is literally the exact opposite of someone who just sits back and waits for the government or the school system or society to hand them a good life. A producer of happiness takes full ownership of their outcomes.
And how exactly does one become a producer of happiness? Well, through the core principle of self-help. And we're not just talking about reading self-improvement books here. The text defines it as a deep-seated spirit of relying on one's own efforts. It's this active, relentless striving to improve your own situation, no matter what your external circumstances are. This spirit of self-help is presented as the direct antidote to that trap of collective responsibility we discussed earlier.
The author uses a fantastic metaphor to explain this. The idea of continuously sowing good seeds in the garden of your mind so you can reap a successful life. What are these seeds exactly? First, it's fully embracing that spirit of self-help we just defined. Second, it's maintaining rigorous positive thinking, meaning you focus on solutions and opportunities rather than just dwelling on systemic flaws. And third, it's continuously putting in the actual effort required to grow. If you plant these seeds, the text argues, you will inevitably harvest a prosperous life, totally regardless of the system around you, which leads us perfectly to the ultimate conclusion of the source material.
Section 5, The Key to Success. Achieving Victory. After stripping away all the excuses of systemic blame and redefining the true purpose of knowledge, the author lands on this definitive statement. The ability to think is the ultimate key to victory in life. It's not about having a flawless education system, and it's certainly not about just memorizing facts for a test. It is all about cultivating your own internal capacity to reason, to apply the spirit of self-help, and to actively produce your own reality. We have covered a major paradigm shift today, moving from blaming the collective to truly empowering the individual. So I want to leave you with a question to reflect on as you look at your own life and the systems you operate within. How are you using your own ability to think to actively produce your own happiness today? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the consensus and cultivating those good seeds. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are doing something really fascinating. We're going to impartially unpack the core tenets presented right on the covers of Ryuho Okawa's intriguing book, The Laws of Prosperity. Now, whether you're a deep dive reader of philosophical and spiritual texts, or you're just kind of curious about how different belief systems attempt to structure the path to success, you are absolutely in the right place. We're focusing entirely on the visual and textual architecture of this book's cover today to see exactly how it promises to reshape our understanding of the world. Let's get right into it. Okay, so looking at this Japanese edition, you'll notice the wraparound band at the bottom. In Japanese publishing, that's known as an obi, and it clearly labels this book as the fourth volume in the author's overarching Law series. That obi is actually totally crucial because it acts as the primary marketing pitch to the reader. It lays out exactly what real-world value the book claims to offer, so it's not presenting itself as just some standalone theory. Rather, it's a foundational piece of a much larger, ongoing philosophical curriculum. Here's our roadmap for exploring this text today. 1. Calls for a new paradigm. 2. Beyond the moral culture. 3. Reality of the spirit world. 4. Theories on life success. And 5. Revolution through faith.
Starting off with part 1, calls for a new paradigm.
You know how paradigm gets thrown around a lot as an empty buzzword? Well, the Japanese text here explicitly defines it. It's laid out as a set of fundamental, bedrock values that are absolutely meant to actively shape and carve out a successful future. The text sets up this premise that the old ways of thinking just aren't cutting it anymore for true prosperity. Basically, a complete ideological reset is required for the reader to move forward. To achieve this reset, the author lays down these 5 structural pillars, sort of like stepping stones. What's really fascinating here is the journey these bullet points take you on. They start off in a deeply abstract, almost metaphysical place, and then systematically step down into highly practical, action-oriented mindsets. So let's look at how the author actually constructs this bridge between the unseen and the seen. Moving into part 2, Beyond the Moral Culture and the Spirit World. The book actually anchors its initial arguments in the events of September 1997. It points to the back-to-back deaths of Princess Diana and Mother Teresa as a catalyst to really spark a serious conversation about the afterlife.
It argues that a person's destination after death, whether that's heaven or hell, is strictly determined by their thoughts and deeds during their physical life. It posits a spirit world where our normal concepts of space and time, they just don't apply. They're entirely different from our own. Interestingly, it acknowledges Japan's deep-rooted animistic worldview. Think of the spirits and yokai you might see in the 1997 film Princess Mononoke. But it argues that society ultimately has to evolve past animism. Beneath that El Cantare seal, it advocates for a higher religion. It claims we need a definitive framework to teach absolute values of good and evil, and to explain the true meaning of life beyond simple human morality.
All right, part 3, theories on life success.
Let's see how this builds visually. The abstract thoughts for prosperity and thoughts for success translate directly into grounded, worldly applications. Theories on life success and theories on education. The text makes a direct causal link here. It claims that by aligning your internal spiritual thoughts with the higher laws of the spirit world, you can directly influence your practical education and your physical success in life. It's essentially pitching a unified theory where spiritual enlightenment and material prosperity aren't at odds at all. They're actually two sides of the exact same coin.
And part 4, revolution through faith. The text makes a really bold pivot right here. It claims that this revolution through faith isn't merely for quiet personal enlightenment or comfort in the afterlife. No, it is explicitly presented as a sharp, practical tool for escaping management crises in the highly competitive business world. This is where the paradigm shift literally becomes a business strategy. The implication is that systemic corporate failures or management dead ends simply can't be solved by conventional business logic alone. They require a fundamental revolution of the mind and spirit. By applying these spiritual truths, leaders can allegedly innovate and navigate their way out of seemingly impossible professional crises. Summarizing its bold thesis, the OB leaves the reader with this absolute overarching promise. It boldly claims that the comprehensive key to total life guidance, spanning all the way from the reality of the afterlife to overcoming corporate bankruptcy, is contained within the fundamental values of this single volume. It positions itself as a literal, all-encompassing manual for human existence.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really chew on. Regardless of your personal beliefs, the architecture of this text offers a completely fascinating look at how deeply integrated spiritual paradigms might influence our approach to practical, everyday hurdles. How would viewing a standard business or management crisis through the lens of eternal spiritual laws and a revolution through faith fundamentally change the way we problem solve? It's a wildly compelling intersection of the metaphysical and the material. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the paradigms that shape our world. Welcome to today's explainer. If you're a focused learner looking to really unpack the deeper nuts and bolts mechanics of success, well, you're in the exact right place. Today, we're dissecting a truly fascinating philosophy of prosperity derived from a landmark text published back on January 11th, 1997. We're going to break down how this framework completely redefines wealth, taking us from a grand cosmic perspective all the way down to the practical, daily routines you can start using tomorrow morning. To anchor our analysis today, we're looking directly at the original Japanese source material, specifically zeroing in on Chapter 3, which outlines this core mindset for prosperity. What makes this January 1997 text so incredibly compelling is how seamlessly it blends these abstract spiritual concepts with highly practical life and business advice. We're going to impartially map out this unique paradigm so you can see exactly how these ideas are built from the ground up.
Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap. First up, the instinct of faith. Second, habits for true prosperity. Third, building your success capital. And fourth, the power of altruism.
Part 1. The Instinct of Faith. Humanity's Cosmic Position. Now, before the text even touches on the concept of money or business, it establishes a really fascinating philosophical baseline. It draws a very sharp line between human and animal existence. The core argument here is that while animals are fundamentally driven by the basic instinct for physical survival, human beings are separated by what the author calls the instinct of faith. According to the source, this intrinsic spiritual drive, this innate reaching towards something greater than ourselves, is the actual engine that powers human progress.
The framework acknowledges a pretty wild paradox, too. It points out that human beings are incredibly small, almost insignificant, really, when you compare us to the vastness of the cosmos. Yet the text locates our true value and nobility not in our physical size or power, but in our capacity to align our lives with the mind of Buddha or God. In this paradigm, true prosperity isn't just about accumulating stuff. It actually starts with aligning your personal will with this much broader divine will. Let's move to part 2 and see how this builds habits for true prosperity, grounding the abstract.
So how do we actually apply a grand cosmic philosophy to, say, a random Tuesday afternoon? To bridge the gap between the spiritual and the material, the text strongly recommends cultivating what it calls the 4 good habits: reflection, reading, diligence, and daily application. In this context, these aren't just nice, feel-good ideas. They are the essential, rigorous daily steps you have to take to realize actual prosperity. Let's break down the core 3.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how reflection is framed. We so often think of reflection as just passive journaling at the end of the day, right? But this text defines it as a highly proactive spiritual correction. It's the deliberate practice of identifying your mistakes, correcting them, and, in the literal language of the text, erasing sins. It's an active mental purification process designed to keep your mind laser-focused on growth.
The second core habit is reading. But again, it's not viewed as just light entertainment. The text frames reading as literally unlocking and absorbing a vital treasure trove of wisdom. The idea is, if you want to expand your prosperity, you absolutely must first expand your mind. And reading is presented as the primary mechanism for downloading the wisdom of those who have successfully navigated life before you.
And the third habit is diligence. The author makes a brilliant reframing here. Diligence isn't described as grinding through a miserable job just to pay the bills. Instead, it's defined as cultivating the profound ability to genuinely enjoy working. Easier said than done, sure. But the argument is that when work ceases to be a burden and actually becomes a joyful endeavor, the friction to achieving prosperity essentially disappears.
Which brings us to part 3, building your success capital, the holistic portfolio.
Once those daily habits are locked in, we move into the actual mechanics of growth. The source completely redefines capital as a 3-pronged holistic investment in yourself. First, you have financial capital, which means saving your own funds to build a solid economic base. Second is intellectual capital, meaning gathering knowledge and polishing your skills to enhance your capabilities. And third is physical capital, training your physical and mental strength to ensure longevity and stamina. To be truly prosperous, you have to invest heavily across the board.
And this brilliantly illustrates the balance we're talking about. Think of your personal capital as 3 roughly equal slices of a pie. You've got your self-funds, your knowledge and skills, and your physical and mental strength. If you spend all your time frantically saving cash, but you let your physical strength deteriorate, your overall prosperity portfolio is entirely out of balance, and frankly, at serious risk of collapse. In fact, the text offers a pretty stark warning regarding that third slice of the pie. It explicitly states that strict health management is a completely non-negotiable requirement. Without a baseline of physical and mental health, none of the other forms of capital, not your money in the bank, not your brilliant intellect, can actually be leveraged. Health is quite literally the foundational infrastructure of your success. Part 4, the power of altruism, the prosperity loop. This brings us to the final stage of the text's philosophy, where we zoom all the way out from the individual to societal impact. At the absolute heart of this section is a simple yet incredibly demanding quote: "For the world, for people." The text reaches a definitive conclusion here that isolated, entirely self-contained individual happiness does not actually exist. If your pursuit of wealth ends only with yourself, it's fundamentally incomplete. So, the crucial point is that altruism isn't just viewed as some obligatory act of charity in this framework. It is literally the ultimate driver of lasting success. By deploying your 3 types of capital, your funds, your knowledge, and your physical energy, with a genuine heart of service towards others, you create real value in the world. And according to the text, that value creation inevitably cycles right back to you, creating this continuous, self-reinforcing prosperity loop. Which leaves us with a truly profound final thought to consider. We've seen how this framework connects the cosmic instinct of faith all the way down to your daily habits and your personal capital to societal service. But the ultimate test is how it applies to your own daily grind. If true prosperity is actually impossible to achieve entirely alone, who are you building your capital for today? Take a moment to really reflect on that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. I am super excited to have you here today because we are unpacking a truly fascinating architectural blueprint for achievement. We're going to be looking specifically at the concepts laid out in Chapter 4 of our source material, The Laws of Prosperity. Look, whether you're trying to build better personal habits, maybe steer a company through a really tough economic climate, or even just trying to understand the underlying mechanics of national policy, this text offers a highly structured, scalable approach to success. It's essentially a masterclass in building from the ground up, and I literally cannot wait to break this down with you.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We're going to explore this philosophy through a micro to macro lens. We'll start with the paradigm for success, move into individual principles, tackle invincible corporate management, zoom out to the nation's 100-year plan, and wrap up by looking towards the next era.
So, kicking things right off with Section 1, establishing our paradigm for success. Every massive structure needs a solid starting point, right? We are focusing intently here on Chapter 4 of our source material, which was actually published back on January 11th, 1998. And you know what's really captivating about this specific chapter is that despite being written decades ago, it provides a totally timeless architectural blueprint for navigating virtually any era. It doesn't just offer vague, feel-good advice, it structures success as a concrete, scalable system. Think of success like the construction of a massive, enduring skyscraper. The text lays out this great overarching metaphor that we're going to follow today. So your personal habits and your individual mindset, that forms the concrete foundation. Above that, corporate strategy and management provide the structural integrity, the steel beams and walls. And finally, national policy and societal vision act as the overarching roof that protects the whole shebang. You obviously can't have a roof without a foundation, which is why we have to start small.
Which brings us to Section 2, building that foundation through individual success principles.
Now, what's really interesting about this part is the text doesn't just toss out a cliche like work hard. It gives us a very definitive sequential process. Step 1, envision the right vision. You literally have to see it in your mind's eye first. Step 2, fight with new ideas. Innovation is your weapon here. You just can't rely on yesterday's tactics. Step 3, set priorities, meaning you must ruthlessly organize your time and resources. And step 4, persist to the end. I actually want to pause on that fourth step for a second, because the source material heavily emphasizes it. Persistence isn't just about, trying hard. It's defined here as the unwavering commitment to fight through challenges and see a process to its ultimate conclusion. So the crucial takeaway is this. You could have the most brilliant vision in the world, the most disruptive new ideas, and perfect prioritization. But without the grit to stick it out to the very end, those ideas are never going to materialize into reality. Persistence is the glue holding your entire foundation together.
Moving right along to Section 3, Invincible Corporate Management, or basically, how to weather the storm.
So the text offers some very specific advice for companies operating in a recession, arguing for this dual approach. On one hand, you've got a defensive strategy. This is the absolute necessity of shrinking unprofitable sectors. You've just stopped the bleeding, right? But you can't just shrink your way to success. Simultaneously, you've got to deploy an offensive strategy. That means strengthening and investing in your profitable core sectors to prepare for the next phase of growth. It is this really delicate balancing act of cutting your losses while quietly loading the spring for the future. The text actually refers to this mindset as fighting the invincible battle. It's a fascinating concept. The goal during a crisis isn't necessarily to go out and conquer new territory. It's to make sure you simply cannot be defeated. By shrinking the bad and fortifying the good, you completely secure the core of the business. You're creating corporate structural integrity so that when the storm finally passes, you are the one left standing, ready to expand. Now let's zoom out even further for Section 4, designing the roof with the nation's 100-year plan. The source material wades into some macroeconomic theory here with a rather provocative concept. The author posits that budget deficits can often act as a byproduct of democracy. Now, looking at this impartially, the argument presented in the text is that democratic systems can inherently incentivize short-term spending to appease voters, and that, of course, can sometimes lead to a lack of fiscal discipline. It's a striking lens through which to view national finance, and it really sets the stage for the solutions the text proposes next. To counter those potential deficits, the text outlines some strict government reform directives. Essentially, the argument here is that administrative bodies need to adopt the exact same survival traits we just talked about in the corporate section. The text explicitly calls for implementing private sector processing capacity and enforcing strict cost consciousness within the government.
In short, the author is arguing that for a nation to stay financially sustainable, its administrative mechanisms have to be just as efficient and fiscally aware as a private company fighting that invisible battle.
But listen, efficiency alone isn't enough. The text pivots to a long-term solution, emphasizing that true national management requires looking much, much further down the road. It introduces this concept of the 100-year plan. If cutting costs is the defensive strategy of a nation, investing in future value is the offensive strategy. A country can't just manage its current crises. It has to actively design its trajectory for a whole century ahead.
And what does that long-term investment actually look like? Well, according to the text, the pillars of this 100-year plan are heavily rooted in human capital, specifically education, academics, and future value creation. By prioritizing the intellectual and innovative capacity of the next generation, a nation ensures that it's going to consistently generate new value. This is exactly how the roof of our structural metaphor gets completed, by providing a long-term protective vision that shelters both the individuals and the corporations operating underneath it.
Which brings us to our final section, towards the next era, and how we actually apply this blueprint.
So, what does this all mean for you? How are you going to apply this blueprint to your own life or business today? We've seen exactly how these principles scale. Maybe for you, the big takeaway is leaning into that fourth step of individual success, persistence, and finally seeing that personal project all the way through to the end. Or maybe you're managing a team right now and it's time to fight that invincible battle by strengthening your core profitable areas. The absolute beauty of this framework from Chapter 4 is that the architecture of success remains exactly the same no matter the scale. So take these structured insights, build your foundation, and start designing your own future. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating framework for not just surviving, but actually thriving in uncertain times. I mean, let's face it, we live in an era where the future can feel incredibly opaque, and when things get unpredictable, we naturally crave clear, actionable guidance. Well, the framework we're unpacking today provides exactly that. It's a comprehensive, deeply structured approach for coming out on top when the economic or social climate gets tough. Our source material for today is a text called The Laws of Prosperity by Ryuho Okawa. Specifically, we're zeroing in on Chapter 4, which outlines a concrete strategy called Thoughts for Success. Now, what makes this source so compelling is that it completely bypasses all that vague, feel-good advice you usually hear. Instead, it lays out a rigorous, universal strategy that scales all the way from your personal, everyday habits right up to the macroeconomic management of an entire nation. We're going to stick strictly to what the text presents regarding this incredible micro to macro progression.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, philosophy for tough times. Second, the individual success process. Third, corporate management in recessions. Fourth, a 100-year national plan. And finally, interlocking all the gears.
Section 1. Philosophy for Tough Times, the Foundation.
Okay, so this first concept acts as the essential foundation for literally everything else we're about to explore. The author introduces a central motif right out of the gate. He wants us to think of society as a massive, complex machine powered by three interlocking gears. You've got the individual, the corporate, and the national. The absolutely crucial point here is that these three levels, they cannot operate independently. They require a shared, consistent mindset to actually function. Think of it kind of like the transmission in your car, right? If the individual gear loses its teeth, the engine might rev, but the vehicle isn't going anywhere. If individuals lose their drive, or if corporations stop innovating, the whole system just grinds to a halt. You simply cannot have a thriving nation without resilient corporations, and you certainly can't have resilient corporations without focused, driven individuals.
Section 2. The individual success process. Starting small.
Knowing that it all starts at the foundation, we're going to zoom all the way in to the micro level now. The source text breaks individual success down into 4 strict, actionable steps. And honestly, you really can't skip any of these. Step 1 is having a clear vision. You must hold a crystal clear image of your success in your mind. Why? Because if you don't know exactly where you're going, you aren't going to get there. Step 2 is fighting with new ideas. In tough times, you have to innovate continuously. Step 3 is severe prioritization. Look, we all have intensely limited time, energy, and resources. Managing them ruthlessly is a harsh but completely necessary reality if you want to move forward. And step 4 is persistence. But the text is super clear about this. It's not just about simple, blind willpower. It's about a sheer, results-driven tenacity. It's almost an obsessive drive to see your goals through to the very end.
This brings us to a brilliant quote that really captures the mindset required for that second step we just talked about. The text issues a very stark warning. Status quo is the same as regression. Wow. It's a really powerful concept. If you're just relying on yesterday's old ideas, hoping things will magically improve without changing your approach, you aren't just standing still. You are actively moving backward. In difficult economic or social eras, merely maintaining your current state is essentially failing.
So, let me ask you directly. Do your daily habits actually match this need for clear vision and severe prioritization? It's really easy to nod along to these concepts, but actually implementing them, that's a whole different story. If you're feeling stuck right now, whether it's in your career or your personal projects, it is highly likely that one of those 4 strict steps is entirely missing from your routine. Taking a moment to actively audit your own life against this rigid framework is exactly what the author intends for the reader here.
Section 3, Corporate Management in Recessions, the meso level.
When a recession hits, we shift up the ladder to the organizational level to see how that individual persistence translates into strict crisis management. The text outlines a pretty cold, two-sided strategy for businesses. It's all about executing 2 entirely different, almost contradictory actions at the exact same time. On the left side, you have a ruthless defense. You have to aggressively cut unprofitable sectors without hesitation. You've got to strip away the dead weight so you don't sink. But on the right side, you have an aggressive offense. Simultaneously, you must invest heavily and confidently into the sectors that are actually generating profit and showing real promise.
The text describes this as a state of extreme balance. You have to ruthlessly eliminate waste while thoroughly maximizing your strengths. It's an intense, high-stakes balancing act, and it requires incredible nerve from leadership. The logic here is that you can't just turtle up and wait for the storm to pass. You have to actively prepare for future growth, even while you're shrinking the waste. That way, when the economy finally does turn around, your organization is already miles ahead of the competition, totally primed for immediate expansion.
Section 4, a 100-year national plan, the macro level. Zooming out one final time to the macro level, we take these core principles and apply them to national policy. At this level, the author makes a very specific structural argument. Long-term prosperity strictly requires abandoning short-term fixes and handouts. The source material actually offers a critique of modern democratic governance here. It points out that budget deficits often act as an inevitable trap within democracies. Why? Simply because political systems naturally tend to favor short-term comfort, like immediate financial stimulus, to appease voters rather than enacting difficult, structural, long-term solutions. It's a fascinating look at how the author believes the desire for immediate relief can actually compromise an entire nation's future if it's left unchecked.
So what are the solutions at this macro level? Well, it's surprising to think about considering how incredibly rare a true 100-year plan is in modern governance, but the text proposes a few massive structural shifts. First, forcing severe processing ability and strict private sector cost consciousness onto government bureaucracy. Essentially, they're saying we should treat the government budget with the exact same extreme balance and scrutiny that a struggling corporation would use during a recession. Cut the waste, maximize the efficiency. And secondly, a deep, unwavering investment in education and academia. Because ultimately, the text argues it's the people, the educated individuals capable of having clear visions and new ideas who are actually going to build the future value of the nation. It all connects right back to human capital.
Section 5, interlocking all the gears, synthesis.
Synthesizing everything we've just uncovered from this text, notice how these distinct strategies perfectly align. At the individual level, the core strategy is persistence and severe prioritization. At the corporate level, it's that extreme balance of defense and offense. And at the national level, it's a 100-year perspective focused on educational investment and ruthless efficiency. Notice how all 3 tiers, while operating on totally different scales of society, share the exact same underlying DNA. They all demand abandoning short-term comfort to focus entirely on long-term value creation.
And that is the absolute core thesis of the laws of prosperity when facing uncertain times. It's only when individuals, corporations, and governments collectively abandon the lure of short-term comfort and truly lock their respective gears together with a shared, disciplined mindset that society can genuinely prepare for and thrive in a new era. The prosperity of the whole depends entirely on the discipline and vision of its individual parts.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought for you to take away today. What is your own 100-year plan? How are you going to take this multi-layered framework, these vital principles of vision,
ruthless prioritization, extreme balance, and long-term thinking, and apply them to your own life starting tomorrow. The key to unlocking the future is quite literally in your mindset. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. I really hope this deep dive helps you build a clearer path forward. Keep learning, stay focused, and I'll catch you next time.